Okay, so our last lecture series is going to figure out the end of the beginning, right? If 201 is the beginning of your introduction to the humanities, then ancient and medieval cultures should end right there with the medieval and the pre-modern. And it's going to seem a little bit strange that we haven't spent more time talking about the Middle Ages. And I hope that that becomes clear why we haven't done that yet in this lecture series. So the question we're asking ourselves about the Middle Ages is, in the middle of what exactly? And for reference, if this background painting is not familiar to you, this is the great medieval painter Hieronymus Bosch, and the painting is called The Garden of Earthly Delights. And we're going to have an opportunity to see more of it as we come up, and also to explore it this week. So, all right. What is a Middle Age? We've talked about prehistory and history, and now we're talking about how do you periodize history, or how do you split history up into memorable periods so that you can put the pieces together in your mind in a framework that's easier to kind of conceptualize the big picture, right? And I'm going to highlight how the way that we split history up into periods actually structures the core humanities, and in so doing, it also aims our attention in some very specific presentist and Western ways. So let's have a look at this. Core Humanities 203, which is probably the most popular core humanities, right? Which is not the one we're in, but just for reference. American experiences and constitutional change. So this provides an overview of the ideas, institutions, and identities in America, right? This is your sort of localized right here, right now. Now, right? Vaguely, the part of history that we can identify with, let's put it that way, from the colonial period to the present, okay? And that includes liberty, democracy, individualism, federalism, civil rights, environmentalism, industrialization, urbanization, and cultural diversity. I love how cultural diversity just kind of like slips in there at the end, as if it is a part of the conversation with the rest of these. Anyhow, this is also focused on constitutions. So this is the time period that 203 covers, right? Roughly 1620 to 2020. So about 400 years, give or take, depending on if you're starting with the Pilgrims, that's 1620, or Jamestown, and that's 1619. So America as a country its origins fall within this reach, a little bit farther back, but there's a little bit of the like prehistory of America with colonial history, presumably, right? So that's where this ostensibly starts, but really the colonization of the Americas, at least by the British, is well underway by the time we get to the Pilgrims and the settlers, the people who come to stay. So there's been at least a century of trade going on between Europeans and indigenous Americans by the time we start telling the history of America. Kind of weird, sort of. And then that's even a little bit after the European discovery of the Americas in 1492, asterisk, like big old asterisk on that, because that is not when Europeans first arrived in America. That is not when the Western Hemisphere was discovered. I mean, this is some complicated stuff. So the Polynesians have encountered South Americans already, sometime in the 12th century or so. And it's not clear if it's because the Polynesians sailed all the way to the coast of South America, which they may have. They certainly had the technology to do so. Or if it's because indigenous South Americans also had sailing technology and they met somewhere in the middle, generally the Marquess Islands. So this should be a throwback to our discussion of cultures of movement. But You'll also remember from that discussion, we talked about sweet potato DNA, which gave us a totally different map of exchange. And so exactly where those happened is not necessarily revealed on this map, but this map does highlight the fact that this exchange was happening already. So why does it only count when Europeans do it? One. But also, oops, I went the wrong way. Excuse me. But also, what about Vikings, right? They had already been in North America since about the year 1000. So they're already here. They settle a little bit. Their settlements don't tend to be as permanent as later European settlers, but contrary to the previous narrative, they didn't just like go, show up, interact, and then be like, yeah, peace out. No, they settled Greenland for sure. And then on top of settling Greenland, they appear to have had at least intended settlements that were intended to be permanent, even if they didn't end up lasting that long, especially in Labrador and Newfoundland. So Vikings were here already. They just didn't go with the conquest. But the last component that I really want to highlight is the Haudenosaunee Confederation, which we read a little bit and we talked a little bit about earlier in the semester. But I think the Americas group might be particularly interested in this. The Haudenosaunee, also known as the Iroquois League, confederated around the year 1000. And in so doing, they created a constitution, right? The Great Law of Peace is a constitution. And Charles Mann, the science writer and author of 1491, he actually argues that the U.S. Constitution is so radically different from what we see elsewhere in Europe in their constitutional democracies, largely because it is inspired by their contact with the Haudenosaunee, which had been ongoing for more than 2 centuries by the time that there is a Declaration of Independence, right? And an American Constitution. So I think he has a really good argument there. And one of the reasons that it doesn't seem to be more popular is because people think it is impossible for white Europeans to have been influenced by the knowledge practices of non-white, non-Europeans. So that's some tea. Anyhow, so the Haudenosaunee Confederation is an early parliamentary government, and it continues to this day, making it the second oldest parliamentary government still in use today. The next oldest one, or the actually oldest one, is the Alþingi, which is the Icelandic parliament in, well, it's not in Reykjavik, it's outside of Reykjavik, and in Thingvellir, in case you needed to know. And interestingly enough, we have Vikings and Haudenosaunee both establishing parliaments or parliamentary forms of communal government rule, or rule by consensus. Let's put it that way. Right around the same time, the Alþingi is not much older than the Great Law of Peace. It's 930, I believe, so about 70 years prior. And there is definitely no reason to believe that the Haudenosaunee were influenced by the Vikings who had arrived in Newfoundland and Labrador, because the Iroquois Confederation, or the Haudenosaunee, was farther inland, right? So they did not have contact with the Vikings. This emerged entirely independently around the same time. And it'll actually be a bit later. So let's, on our map, so like right here, I should have put a line here, 1215 for the Magna Carta, right? So this is a thing that lots of people are thinking about in different places around the world, not necessarily attributable to Euro-Americans. And so it's interesting to me that Core Humanities 203 is discussing the American experience, but doesn't include any of the pre-Columbian contact between either Europeans or Polynesians and indigenous American people, nor does it discuss the creation of constitutional governments by England, 1215, the Haudenosaunee, Americans, indigenous Americans in around the year 2000, or Vikings, the first people to connect Europe with North America in 930. Like, none of that is included in this conversation. Not to mention the fact that the Americas, while they were not called that, that is a colonizer's name for them, Turtle Island has been inhabited for a really long time. Like a really, really long time. Longer even than the traditional anthropological narratives that we talked about earlier in the semester. In fact, there is an archaeologist at UNR who would date remains of archaeological evidence in Nevada to 30,000 years ago, right? There is a long history in the Americas. So how come Core Humanities gets to define itself, or 203, gets to define itself as the American experience, but only from the European perspective after European settlement? That sounds a little colonialist to me. All right, let's talk about 202. What is the definition there? The modern world, capital M, modern. What is the modern world? Well, according to Core Humanities 202, it's the text, images, and music that trace Europe's interactions with other parts of the world and the legacy of those interactions in shaping ideas, institutions, and cultures from the early modern era to the present. So basically, same time span as 203, but from Europe. So Core Humanities, there are 3 classes that you definitely have to learn. It's all the knowledge you most needful to know. Sorry, that's an Old English joke. Reference to King Alfred. We'll get to that. Anyhow, so 2/3 of the information that every single college student at this university must imbibe before they are allowed to leave is modern and white. It's either European or it's Anglo-American, right? Post-colonization Americas. And that's what makes our world. Hooray! There's no issue here. Cultural artifacts of the Renaissance, Reformation, and Enlightenment. All of that language is going to come back to us in just a little bit. Renaissance, Reformation, Enlightenment. Should have highlighted those. The period of revolution, which we just discussed, and Romanticism. Not my job. And the 20th century, also not my job. Core themes include the impacts of science and industry, political revolutions, colonialism, post-colonialism, and globalization. Interesting. What about 212? 212 is the same class, but with science. Like, literally. So it can be taken as an alternative to 202, which means that we expect it basically to be the same. And actually, as we reform the Core Humanities curriculum, we're going to get rid of 212 and just make this like 202 option, right? So literally the same class, just with more focus on intellectual and cultural movements, right? Emphasis on how scientific and technological developments have impacted modern societies. Except we just learned last week that discussing science as if it is a modern European invention is literally cultural erasure of everything that Europe borrowed from the Islamic Golden Age. Okay. Pause to ponder that for a second. No big deal. Then we get to 201. That's what we're doing together. And why am I contextualizing 201 in relationship to 202, 203, and 212? Well, because we want to understand why we have so much time to cover in 201 and so little for 3 other courses, right? It's just like, okay, let's just take all of the junk from the moment that we are not quite modern and pile it all into one class, because it's not really that important. Like, it's important, but it's like not as important, right? That's literally what the structure of the core humanities is telling us, is that the past is not important. It is not as important for you to know in order to function in the modern world. I will leave it to you whether or not you agree with that position. So, for reference, here's our time frame for specifically the Middle Ages, right? So we've got the high and late Middle Ages in here, and then these are generally called the early Middle Ages. We're going to come back to that discussion. Don't sweat it too much. These are arbitrary markers. I am choosing to use ones that are specific to Britain, because that has impacted a lot of the history of the modern world, but they're around the same time in different parts of Europe, give or take, right? Key one, this one, fall of Rome. This one, very specific to England, because that is the Norman conquest. All right, so, oops, wrong direction. I just keep pressing the wrong arrow today. And then for reference, although this is not happening in Europe, it's something we just discussed. 610 is the emergence of Islam, right? So this is Europe adjacent. So it may be important for us to recognize what's happening right nearby, especially because it is going to so heavily impact Europe as it's happening and after, really. But this is not what we've covered, right? We haven't gone 476 forward. That's makes sense, because that's the Middle Ages. So we also do antiquity, right? If we project backwards to like 0 or so, we've covered Rome, but you got to keep going farther to get through Alexander and the origin. Well, I mean, we've got the origins of Christianity at 0, but then we also need the origins of Judaism, and we can get all the way back to Mesopotamia if we stretch our history of Europe back there, except that Mesopotamia is not in Europe. That's not a thing. No. Mesopotamia is in the Middle East, and we're like, yeah, definitely, that's our past. For sure. So the Middle East's past belongs to us when we like it, because it is advanced. Look at that civilization, the invention of agriculture and irrigation and writing technology and the wheel and the domestication of animals as beasts of burden so that we can plow our fields. Definitely belongs to us. Islam, no, no, definitely not us. What? What are we doing? What are we doing when we tell the history of ourselves and we say, yes, ancient culture, we hearken from ancient Mesopotamia, the great European civilizations. You can just march right on backwards from Rome to Greece to Mesopotamia. Notice that like eastward movement, and then modernization moves westward. Modernization follows the sun, right? It rises in the east of Mesopotamia and then peaks in antiquity over the high element of Greece and Rome. And then as it moves forward into the future of humanity, it goes west across Europe. I'm doing this backwards from your sense of east and west. I'm sorry. And then farther west to the Americas and the West Coast and Manifest Destiny. This is a pretty tricky way to tell history, and it has some ethical ramifications. I'm going to leave my commentary there for now, because there already was a history in these places before Europeans arrived. Right? We need to be reminded of this. Not to mention the fact that Mesopotamia and the Middle East continued to have its own history into the modern period. And it was not medieval. Right? But also, there were other parts of the Western Hemisphere that had their own histories. Right? We have the northeast of the Americas, which is generally North America at or east of the Mississippi. So that includes Cahokia, and that includes the Haudenosaunee, right? And then later, that also includes all of the Algonquian peoples who settle on the northeast coast, which is super densely populated. When European explorers arrive, they bring a bunch of disease, and so it's not so densely populated when the pilgrims arrive and they're like, we're going to move in, because everybody's already dead. Not everybody, but a lot of people. So that's a thing. Now, what about these other cultures that we have been studying, right? We have been looking at all of these cultures. Do these same categories apply to them? Can we really say that like civilization and a Middle Ages and modernity happen in the same way? Are these spaces entitled to modernity, so to speak? Right? Particularly when we recognize that many of these cultures are much older than Europe, right? So yeah, there's folks in Europe. This is our orange line here, right? There's folks in Europe at this time. They're Celtic peoples. But at this point in time, right, let's go back 8,500 BCE is roughly when all of these other spaces, right? These three in America, these spaces in America, in the Americas, and then these civilizations that we have been studying as a class, they are developing independently of one another, right around squishy the same time. They are developing agriculture, right? Europe, not so much, right? They're not doing that just yet. They get there a little bit later. And so when we start looking at this, yeah, they exist. They exist in these spaces, but not in the same way that these other cultures have been developing, right? Even more important, if we think way back to the beginning when we were talking about what counts as human history, right? The evolutionary scale, we're talking 30,000 years ago, there are folks in most of these places, right, that we have been studying. So how do we reconcile our study of ancient cultures beginning with, I don't know, Mesopotamia or Homer, right? That's way, way, way up here, right? Well, Mesopotamia is like in here. Homer is like in here. And that's a lot of human history to just be like, not so important. It's fine. It's fine. And what about the fact that there are other places in the world where settled cultures are not necessarily the centralized norm, or at least they become the norm later on, right? There are civilizations in sub-Saharan Africa, but just like in the Amazon, the abundance of food that is available makes it unnecessary to cultivate agriculture, which makes it unnecessary to cultivate settled societies and fortification and stratification. Same as we discussed with the Americas, similar to what we talked about with Oceania. Although that is a special case because in Oceania, you now have the added issue of islands and travel. So a totally different way of existing in the world based on an island environment and an island geography. All right, so that's the picture about 50,000 years ago, right? We have Mesopotamia, Africa, specifically in sub-Saharan regions, and we have the Indus Valley. There's folks here 50,000 years ago. There's folks farther east, not quite so long ago, and Europe, less than that. And then the Americas, I'm going to leave that alone because that becomes a whole other contest between did indigenous Americans arrive, or did they independently and spontaneously evolve on a separate continent? That is a different question for other folks that we have interrogated another time. And then just for perspective, when we talk about the long history of humanity on like the evolutionary timescale, Africa is the one that goes way back. like 200,000 years way back, right? Homo sapiens, that's where they are. Remember, they're Neanderthals in Europe and they're Homo erectus in Asia. And none of those are happening quite as early as Homo sapiens in Africa. So this is the time scale that we're talking about for human history. And when we say 201, ancient and medieval cultures, let's limit ourselves to maybe at best Mesopotamia, and then move forward through Europe. We are limiting our scope of human history to like this window here, right? We're going to go, whoops, nope, I didn't mean to. Anyway, tiny window. So in the context of that, what is medieval, right? Like it's this like weird time period where it's before we become modern, but it's not super old yet. It's the Middle Age, the medium Ævum. That's what it means. But in the middle of what exactly? Not this. It is not medieval times. Middle Ages. Medieval is an adjective. Middle Ages. Don't do this to me. Please, for the love of God, don't do this to me. Please. So, Middle Age. Let's get medieval. All right. If we go back to our chart from the addition or from the establishment of agriculture forward, right? Let's put this back in perspective. We're going to go back to just civilization, but on this chart now, notice this is not specifically because we are establishing cities. We're just using the same time frame. So cities start to be established different places all over the globe, roughly from 6000 BCE forward, right? Now, in the middle of what means there has to be something before and something after. So let's talk about the after first.